The spring of 1841 descended upon Colleton County, South Carolina, not with gentle warmth, but with an oppressive, suffocating heat that made the very air feel solid. Along the Combahee River, the water moved with a sinister slowness, its dark surface a perfect mirror for the Spanish moss that dripped from ancient live oaks like funeral shrouds. This was the Lowcountry, a landscape of breathtaking beauty built upon a foundation of breathtaking cruelty. Here, endless rice paddies shimmered under the sun, their flooded fields a testament to wealth extracted from human misery. Hundreds of enslaved people spent their lives moving through that water, knee-deep from dawn until the last light failed, their suffering the silent engine of prosperity for men who had long ago convinced themselves that evil was simply the natural order of things. Cypress Grove Plantation, a spread of 800 moderately productive acres, was the domain of Silas Rutledge. He was a man perpetually on the edge of the county's elite, a position that fueled a desperate, gnawing ambition. With 58 enslaved people, he was wealthy by any common measure, but in the stratified society of Colleton County, he was barely mid-tier. The true titans, the families whose names could open any door or shatter any reputation with a single whispered word, owned thousands of acres and hundreds of souls. They summered in Charleston and sent their sons to northern universities, existing in a world Silas could only gaze at from a distance. He was a tall man, gaunt in the way of those who forget to eat when consumed by obsession, his prematurely gray hair lending him a severe look that perfectly matched his cold temperament. In business, he was shrewd but just honorable enough, a man who drove a hard bargain but always kept his word, a carefully constructed facade for the monster that lurked beneath. His life's ambition had been twofold: to ascend into the inner circle of power and to manage the difficult burden of his daughter, Catherine. Born in 1813, the same year his practical, ledger-keeping wife Elizabeth died in childbirth, Catherine had grown up a ghost in her own home. Isolated, educated by a string of nervous tutors, she belonged nowhere. By 1841, at 28 years old, she was a prisoner in a body that had betrayed her, weighing nearly 260 pounds. Her form was swollen, a side effect of years of medications, laudanum, mercury compounds, prescribed by doctors who diagnosed her with the catch-all curses of hysteria and female nervous disorders. She was prone to violent fits, screaming and hurling objects with terrifying strength. A year prior, she had lunged at her father with a letter opener, leaving a pale, thin scar across his left hand that served as a constant, visible reminder of her instability. The whispers of polite society followed her like a shadow. Poor Silas Rutledge, they would murmur with false sympathy, burdened with such a mad daughter. What a terrible shame. She was such a pretty child. None of them knew the truth. None of them had any idea that Catherine's madness was not a disease, but a rational, desperate response to having lived for 16 years with the knowledge of what monsters did in the dark. None of them knew what she had witnessed as a girl of 12. A secret so vile it had been easier for her father to poison her mind and body than to risk her ever speaking of it. Then, in April, Silas Rutledge made an announcement that sent a shockwave through even the most calloused corners of plantation society. He was placing his daughter, Catherine, under the complete and total authority of an enslaved man named Ezekiel Cross. Not as a nurse, not as a companion, but as her keeper, her master in every way that mattered beyond a piece of paper. The white society of Colleton County was scandalized, but their outrage was born of ignorance. They had no idea of the true, horrifying game being played, nor could they possibly comprehend what Ezekiel Cross was about to unleash upon Catherine, her father, and the entire rotten foundation of their world. By November, Catherine's body would be transformed in ways no one could explain. 13 of the county's most powerful men would be dead, and Cypress Grove Plantation would be nothing more than a smoking pyre of ash. It all began with a letter that arrived on April 7th, delivered not by the post, but by a private courier. Silas opened it in the heavy silence of his study, the scent of old paper and bourbon hanging in the air. He expected correspondence about rice futures or land deeds. Instead, he found 3 pages of expensive cream-colored paper, sealed with a dollop of red wax bearing a symbol that made his blood run cold, a scythe crossed with stalks of wheat. It was the mark of the Brethren of the Harvest. The Brethren were 13 men, the secret heart of the county's power, who gathered in darkness to perform rituals they believed strengthened the land through blood sacrifice. They were a grotesque fusion of old European traditions and the spiritual beliefs they had twisted and stolen from the very people they enslaved. Their core tenet was simple and savage. The strong were meant to consume the weak, literally, when the ritual demanded it. Silas had been a member since 1822, a participant in rites that ranged from the deeply disturbing to the utterly monstrous. The letter was a notice of debt. $12,000, an impossible sum accumulated through years of disastrous gambling and failed investments. Repayment would mean ruin, the sale of his land, his slaves, the utter destruction of everything he had spent his life building. But the letter offered an alternative. A demonstration of commitment, it was called, for members in difficult positions. Silas was to take his daughter, Catherine, and publicly place her under the complete authority of one of his enslaved men for 1 full year. The man would have total control over her person, her daily life, her treatment. It was an act of profound, calculated humiliation. In a society that preached the sanctity of white womanhood, Silas would be declaring his own daughter worth less than his property. But if he complied, his debt would be wiped clean, and the brethren would see to it that his fortunes were restored. He sat in his study for hours that night, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. Bankruptcy was a death sentence. The brethren had their tentacles wrapped around every judge, lawyer, and politician in the state. They could make him vanish. Or, he could sacrifice his daughter's dignity to preserve his own status. It was the choice his world had trained him to make his entire life. Property over people. Power over morality. By candlelight, he wrote his acceptance. 3 days later, another letter arrived containing a name, Ezekiel Cross, age 33. Recently purchased from a Virginia plantation. Skills: carpentry, herbal medicine. Temperament: quiet, obedient. What the letter omitted was that Ezekiel Cross had been chosen for this role with surgical precision. His arrival at Cypress Grove was no accident. He was a man who carried his own burning, patient need for justice, a man who had waited years for exactly this moment. Ezekiel arrived on April 13th, sitting in the back of a wagon that pulled right up to the main house. Silas came out onto the porch, shielding his eyes. The first thing he noticed was Ezekiel's gaze. Most enslaved people learned to keep their eyes downcast as a tool of survival, but Ezekiel looked directly at Silas, his expression unervingly calm and assessing. He was tall, powerfully built, his skin strangely free of the whip scars that marked so many. "You understand why you are here?" Silas asked, his voice tight. "Yes, sir." Ezekiel's voice was deep and measured. "My daughter is unwell. Doctors have failed. You claim knowledge of herbal treatments." "My grandmother was a healer, sir. She taught me what she knew." The transaction was swift. Ezekiel was shown to a small cabin near the main house, set apart from the others. He was told his sole duty was Catherine's care, and that failure would bring consequences too terrible to imagine. Left alone, the mask of obedience finally fell from his face. His jaw unclenched, his shoulders settled. From inside his shirt, he pulled a small, worn cloth bundle. He unwrapped it to reveal a scrap of paper bearing 3 names written in a child's uncertain hand, * Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, * his wife, his son, his daughter. Sold away from him 3 years ago to a death camp of a plantation in Alabama. He had later learned they were all dead within 18 months. Sarah from a fever, Benjamin from a neglected injury, and 6-year-old Ruth from a grief so profound she simply stopped eating. The man who had sold them, who had split his family like kindling merely to demonstrate his own cold-blooded resolve to the brethren, was Silas Rutledge. Ezekiel had spent 2 years working his way south, being sold from one plantation to the next, listening to whispers, gathering information, learning about the secret society of monsters who believed they were above all consequence. Now, he was here. He had access, and he knew that true justice sometimes came not from laws, but from patience, from planning, and from a willingness to become every bit as monstrous as your enemy. He folded the paper and lay back, staring at the ceiling, and began to plan. His first meeting with Catherine was a clash of wills. A house slave named Judith led him to her second-floor room, knocking reluctantly. "Miss Catherine, your father has brought someone for your treatments." A crash echoed from within, followed by Catherine's voice, slurred but venomous. "Send him away." Ezekiel stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The room was a tomb, dark, stale, smelling of unwashed linen and the sweet, metallic rot of mercury. Catherine sat by a cold fireplace, her face puffy, her eyes unfocused. "Who are you?" she demanded. "I said no more doctors." "I am not a doctor, miss. My name is Ezekiel." "Help." She laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "That's what they all say. They mean poison. They mean chains. They mean silence." She swayed to her feet. "He is punishing me again. For remembering." Ezekiel stood perfectly still. "What are you supposed to forget?" The question stopped her. Her anger faltered, replaced by a flicker of vulnerability. She studied him, truly seeing him for the first time. "Do you know what they do in the cellar?" she whispered. His pulse hammered, but his face remained a placid mask. "I do not know what you mean, miss." "Liar," she said, but with exhaustion, not heat. "Everyone lies." Ezekiel moved to the window and, in one swift motion, tore open the heavy curtains. Sunlight flooded the room. Catherine cried out, shielding her eyes. "What if the doctors are wrong?" he asked, his voice low but clear. Her hands dropped. She stared at him, terror and a wild, desperate hope warring in her eyes. "What did you say?" This was the moment. "I said, what if the doctors are wrong? What if everything you've been told is designed not to help you, but to keep you silent and controllable? What if your father has been poisoning you for years, to make sure you never become well enough to speak of what you saw?" Absolute silence descended. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, clearer, sharper. "Why would you say this? This is a trick. I am telling you I can help you become truly well, strong enough to walk out of this room. But it will be painful, and your father will not approve." "Then why?" she demanded. "Why would you do it?" Ezekiel met her gaze, the truth a dangerous weapon between them. "Because I have my own reasons for wanting Silas Rutledge to suffer. And the surest way to make him suffer is to give him back a daughter who is sane enough to remember everything, and strong enough to speak of it." "You want revenge," she breathed. "Yes, miss." "What did he do to you?" "He sold my family, my wife and 2 children. He sent them to their deaths to prove something to men who judge a man's worth by his capacity for cruelty." Catherine absorbed this, and a slow, terrible understanding dawned in her eyes. "The brethren," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. She leaned forward, the madness in her eyes replaced by a chilling, focused rage. "If I agree, what happens then?" "You get well, miss," Ezekiel said. "And when you are well, we decide what comes next. I have my revenge to plan. You have yours. Perhaps they align." Catherine studied him for a long moment. "I want them all dead," she said, her voice a low snarl. "My father, Judge Pelham, Reverend Crenshaw, every man who stood in that cellar. I want them to suffer first, to know it is coming, to beg." The venom was shocking. This was not madness. This was rage, purified and concentrated by years of suppression. Ezekiel gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Then we have an understanding." "Know something, Ezekiel?" Catherine's eyes glittered. "I have killed before. House slaves who might have told my father about my lucid moments. The laudanum blurs the details, but I know I did it. So if you betray me, know that I am not a victim. I am something much, much worse." A chill traced its way down Ezekiel's spine. He had sought an ally. He had found a fury. "I will not betray you, Miss Catherine." "Good," she said, standing more steadily than before. "Then let us begin." The following weeks were an agonizing crucible. Ezekiel slowly weaned Catherine off the laudanum, replacing it with herbal tinctures to ease the brutal withdrawal. For 3 days, she was consumed by fever and tremors, but he never left her side. As the toxins cleared, so did her mind. He forced her to walk, first a few steps, then down the hall, then further each day. He regulated her diet, replacing heavy starches with lean protein and vegetables. And as her body healed, they talked. She told him everything she remembered from that night when she was 12. The cellar, the altar, the woman's screams, the sight of her father and the others carving pieces from the body and consuming them in a ritualistic feast. She told him of the 16 years of gaslighting that followed, of the hidden journal where she documented everything she could in a cryptic code. In turn, Ezekiel told her of his family, of Sarah's songs, of Benjamin's brilliant mind, of Ruth's love for wildflowers. He described the day Silas Rutledge had arrived, inspecting them like livestock before casually, cruelly, tearing their family apart. He smiled when he did it, Ezekiel said, his voice a dead monotone. That is what I will never forget. My son crying, my wife trying to be brave, and your father, smiling. Catherine listened, her newly clear eyes filled with a cold fury. I am sorry, she said. But I promise you, Ezekiel, he will pay for what he took from you. They will all pay. The night Silas made his formal announcement was a masterclass in deception. Before the county's elite, Catherine played the part of the meek, recovering daughter, agreeing to her father's shocking arrangement. Ezekiel moved among them, a silent, invisible servant, listening, watching. Later that night, he and Catherine met. I have it all documented, she told him, revealing a hidden box of papers. Names, dates, rituals. But no one will believe the word of a mad woman and a slave. Then we need proof they cannot deny, Ezekiel said. I know where they keep it. Catherine's voice dropped to a whisper. A ledger. It details every ritual, every sacrifice, for 40 years. It's their insurance policy. Everyone is equally guilty. It's hidden in a secret room, off the main cellar. When can we get to it? My father travels to Charleston on May 14th. He'll be gone for 3 days. For 2 weeks, they prepared, their whispered conversations in the dead of night, a conspiracy of vengeance. On May 14th, Silas departed as planned. That night, they descended into the cellar. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, old smoke, and something else, something foully organic. Catherine led him to a section of the stone wall and pressed a specific rock. A hidden door swung inward. Inside the small chamber, on a wooden stand, sat the ledger, a massive, leather-bound tome. Ezekiel opened it. The pages were filled with meticulous, clinical descriptions of atrocities. He saw rituals timed to agricultural cycles, believing blood fed the land. He saw the names of at least 37 victims, enslaved people, poor whites, anyone who wouldn't be missed. And then he saw the notes on consumption. They had not just killed. They had feasted. Dear God, he whispered, his hands shaking. I told you. Catherine's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. I watched them. I was 12. He found the entry for his family. 3 cold, dismissive lines. Asterisk purchased family unit from Virginia. Separated from mail to demonstrate resolve. Sent to Alabama contact. Asterisk that was all his world's destruction had merited. As Catherine frantically copied the most damning entries, they became so absorbed they didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs. The first sign was a sudden flare of brighter light from the outer chamber. Silas Rutledge stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 men. I must admit, I am impressed, he said, his voice unervingly calm. I never trusted your miraculous recovery, Catherine. I left this morning, but I returned and watched, waiting to see what you would do. Did you truly think I would not prepare for this? They were caught. Dragged upstairs to the study, they heard more men arriving. The brethren were assembling. Finally, they were led back down to the cellar, which had been transformed. All 13 members were present, robed and seated in a circle, the altar draped in crimson. Ezekiel and Catherine were forced into the center. They saw the ledger, Silas announced. Then they must be silenced, Judge Pelham declared. I disagree, Silas said, turning to Ezekiel. I am offering you a choice. You want revenge. I will give it to you. Not against me, but against Edward Gaines, the man in Alabama who worked your family to death. Join us. Not as an equal, but as an associate. Prove your loyalty, and I will give you the resources to utterly destroy him. All it costs is your soul. The offer was grotesque, a snake coiling in the air between them. Refuse, Silas continued, and you both die tonight. Ezekiel looked at Catherine. She gave the faintest shake of her head. Don't. But he saw a path, a desperate, dangerous gamble. I accept, Ezekiel said, his voice firm. On one condition. Catherine goes free. Send her away from here, give her money, a new life. Do that, and I am yours. After a moment of tense debate, Silas agreed. The deal was struck. Catherine would be sent north the next day. Ezekiel's initiation would be in 3 weeks. As she was led away, Catherine looked back at him one last time, and in her eyes, he saw not defeat, but understanding. She knew this was not surrender. It was strategy. The next 3 weeks were a living hell. Under constant watch, Ezekiel played the part of a broken man who had chosen survival. But he was observing, learning, mapping the plantation's weaknesses. The night before his initiation, Silas visited his cabin. Tomorrow you will be asked to do something difficult, Silas warned. Do not hesitate. If you fail the test, you die. And so does Catherine. Yes, I know she is not in Philadelphia. My people are watching for her. Her life is in your hands. The next night, in the candle-lit cellar, Ezekiel was brought before the robed brethren. On the altar lay a bound and gagged young woman, her eyes wide with terror. This is your test, Silas said, holding out a long, wicked knife. Make the first cut. Prove your loyalty. Ezekiel took the knife. He looked at the terrified woman on the altar, and in her eyes, he saw his wife, his children, 100 generations of suffering. He saw everything he was fighting for. He stepped toward the altar, raised the knife high, and spun, burying the blade in the throat of the nearest brethren member. Chaos erupted. In the flickering darkness, Ezekiel became a whirlwind of pure, focused rage. He was not a soft man of privilege. He was a force of nature forged in grief and hardened by injustice. He fought his way to the altar, cut the woman's bonds, and screamed, "Run!" As she fled up the stairs, he turned to face the remaining men. You have made a terrible mistake, Silas snarled. Maybe, Ezekiel panted. But I'll take as many of you with me as I can. What Silas didn't know was that the woman's escape was a signal. For 3 weeks, Catherine had not been hiding. She had been recruiting. Moving between plantations in the dead of night, she had gathered an army of the dispossessed. 23 men and women who had lost family to the brethren, who had endured a lifetime of brutality, who had nothing left to lose. Armed with axes, scythes, and generations of suppressed fury, they descended into the cellar. The slaughter was not a battle, it was a reaping. The brethren, who had built their power on the suffering of others, now faced the consequences. In the chaos, Silas grabbed Catherine, holding a knife to her throat. Stop, or she dies. Catherine looked at her father, her eyes burning with cold fire. Do it, she hissed. It changes nothing. You have already lost. She slammed an elbow into his ribs, breaking his hold, and before he could recover, Ezekiel was upon him. You took everything from me, Ezekiel said, his voice low and dangerous. Please, Silas begged, the single word a pathetic whimper. Did my wife say please? Did my children? Ezekiel asked, and then there was no more talking. When it was over, 13 of the most powerful men in South Carolina lay dead on the cellar floor. Now what? Ezekiel asked, his chest heaving. Catherine's smile was a grim slash in the candlelight. Now, she said, we burn it all down. They worked quickly, dousing the cellar, the bodies, and the cursed ledger in oil. Ezekiel paused only to tear out the single page that recorded his family's fate, tucking it safely inside his shirt. Then, Catherine touched a candle to the fuel. Flames erupted with a hungry roar. They fled the house and stood in the yard, watching as Cypress Grove Plantation became a towering inferno against the pre-dawn sky. As the sun rose, casting a golden light on the black plume of smoke, they planned their escape. The official story would be a tragic accident. No one would ever know the truth. "What will you do now?" Catherine asked. "Go north," Ezekiel said. "Use this chaos to disappear. Maybe find others. Build a network to help our people escape. I cannot bring my family back, but I can make sure others don't suffer as they did." "I will go north as well," Catherine replied. "And I will write all of this down. I will hide it, code it, leave it for a future that might be ready to hear it. The truth has a way of surfacing, eventually." They walked away from the ashes in opposite directions, two ghosts disappearing into a country on the brink of change. They never saw each other again. History recorded a tragic fire, a terrible loss for Colleton County. No one questioned it. The whispers, however, persisted for generations in the slave quarters, tales of a night when the masters burned, when justice came like a cleansing fire, delivered by a haunted woman and an avenging man. Years later, during the Civil War, Union soldiers found strange bones in the swamps near the old plantation grounds. And decades after that, a coded journal was rumored to have been found in a wall, only to vanish from county records, taken by those who still had secrets to protect. This story teaches us a chilling lesson, that power built on cruelty is a fragile foundation. That secrets buried in darkness will always, eventually, fight their way to the light. And that sometimes, the people society deems most powerless hold the most dangerous weapon of all, the absolute refusal to forget. What do you think really happened to Catherine's journal? Does a secret network of the powerful still exist, hiding the sins of their ancestors? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found yourself captivated by this descent into historical darkness, be sure to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss the next time we unearth a story that history tried to bury. Until then, remember that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who wear a human face.